Can one work in a situation where the source of the money may be impermissible? There's some nuance to this question. This happens particularly in certain countries, right, where large charities or a lot of government funding for particular types of charities is through lotteries and the like. So the fiqh related to it is that you cannot work in a line of work that is in itself impermissible. So you cannot do things that are haram for someone whose primary activity is something that is directly impermissible. Those are the two things that, in terms of the permissibility of your employment, that you cannot do the haram for someone whose primary activity would be considered haram. Right? So you cannot, so if you're working, you have to see what's their line of work, and but if a company has a range of activities, some of them impermissible. So you work for a publishing company. Is publishing permissible in general? Yes. So you can work in publishing even if some of what they publish is impermissible. But you cannot be working in their pornography department or whatever, as is obvious, right? Because you cannot be working in the haram for someone who's the work itself, that their line of activity is directly impermissible, right? So but then of course many complicated issues come. Can you work for the maker of firearms? And fiqh-wise you can, because do firearms have a legitimate use? Yeah. In war they do, in self-defense they do. So whatever, within the parameters of law and fairness. Now you're not responsible if many use them in impermissible ways. But there's an element of dislikedness that when you have discretion, you avoid things that are associated with the impermissible to the extent you can. But we don't always have the luxury of choice in that. A third governing criterion with respect to employment is that we do not hold non-Muslims responsible for the rulings of the Sharia. It's simple as that, right? We do not hold non-Muslims responsible for the rulings of the Sharia. Now we cannot do the wrong and we cannot be directly party to what we hold to be wrong. But if you're in a non-Muslim country and, let's say there's a foundation or an endowment or some source of funding that the source of funding is fully from lottery or some other mode of gambling or whatever, can you accept that funding in itself? Yes. Because we do not hold non-Muslims responsible for the rulings of the Sharia. Just as if your next door neighbor owns a company called, only beer. Right? They sell beer and only beer, called Bob. Beer and only beer. So they don't sell anything but beer. Not even chewing gum. Like nothing. Beer and only beer. And they invite you for food. Can you transact with someone? Because we do not hold non-Muslims responsible for the rulings of Sharia. But if your friend Bob, your neighbor Bob becomes Muslim, then the standard changes. Because now we do hold them responsible. So the standard would change. In those cases, there's fiqh related to it. But broadly, this is a guiding principle. So we cannot be engaged in the haram, but we don't hold them responsible for those things. Right? So if you have, so in those cases, if there's funding from those kinds of sources, it is permissible to take. But if someone were to choose to avoid it, that's a consideration of caution, right? But some scholars suggest one could take it for secondary purposes, right? Like don't build a masjid using lottery money from the government, for example. Right? There's sacredness to it. But if you have projects to feed the homeless, etc., use it in things that are social purposes rather than religious purposes. And those things is best to consult about. Allah. So that's with respect to the lottery. And the same principles apply to Walmart, working for a company that sells some impermissible things. That if the work you're doing is permissible, and the line of work of the company you're working in is permissible, it is permissible to work in that. We have a whole slew of answers on Seekers Hub about the principle of assisting in sin. And especially the Hanafi school is quite expansive when it comes to the issue of assisting in sin, and it distinguishes between what is direct involvement and indirect involvement. That at the level of moral obligation, you're not morally culpable for things where the relationship between you and the sin committed is indirect. But where you can avoid it, it's superior. So let's say if you own a shopping mall, do all the shops in your shopping mall have to be Sharia compliant? No. They have to comply with the law. Right? So if you're, let's say, in a Muslim country, and because some things are public responsibility, right? So upholding the Sharia publicly is a public responsibility. It's not your direct responsibility. We're not God's policemen on earth. Okay? So what the laws are, what can, in that sense, that is the public responsibility. So if we're operating in a Muslim society, we'd have to keep in mind what the public law is and be within that. And in a Muslim society, we'd have more personal responsibility because we hold that Muslim person is morally responsible. So we deal with them accordingly. But even in a Muslim society, and the fuqaha use this example in Hanafi fiqh. Let's say if you have a storefront, let's say, and you're going to rent it out to someone who's going to use it as a temple for idol worship. Are you allowed to rent that place out? Let me ask you guys a question. Are you allowed to rent it out? So the Hindu World Association, or they call it WA, World Association of Hindus, right? WA, right? Comes to you and said, we want to lease this unit to use as a temple. Can you rent it out? Can you? In the Hanafi school, you can. Because what are you doing? You're renting out a space. That's what you're doing. Is your usage permissible? Is the act of you renting out a space permissible? Yes. Could they use it in a permissible way? Yes. Are you directly assisting them in that which is wrong? No, you're not. That's by their choice. Now, there's a public regulation of it in a Muslim society. The local authorities, etc., zoning, etc. And sometimes people wonder how come non-Muslims can't do certain things in Muslim countries? And the answer is very simple. Have ever heard about zoning laws? Like, we just moved to a new house. Could we rent the place we rented on wherever we rented it? Could we turn it into Seekers Hub 3.0? No, because the area is not zoned like that. So in traditional Muslim society, that's zoning. In Muslim areas, there's certain things that you can't do. In Christian areas, you can do whatever you feel like. Right? Common sense. So that's not considered assisting in sin. But where you can avoid it, right? You have two offers. One, someone wants to open a coffee shop, and someone wants to open something that we would hold to be wrong. Then when you have a choice, you choose what's better. But it's an important principle to be clear about. If you go to Seekers Hub, you'll see a number of answers on the principle of assisting in sin, for more detail on that. But of course, that does not preclude caution where it's within your discretion to exercise caution. So sometimes life is complicated, right? That if you have two options, right? The coffee shop versus a beer store, right? And of course, even in Canada, we have a lot of zoning requirements. You can't just open a beer store anywhere, right? So compliant, and Islam is not some foreign fantastical entity. Many of these public regulations are for the same reason, for regulation of public interest. You can't just open it. Like even if you're a Christian, you can open in a Christian area because that's where presumably the alcohol drinkers would be, right? Travelers used to say, if you go to Muslim world, look for the church steeples, because that's where you'll find the liquor stores. And it's certainly true in Damascus. I only know because I used to walk through the Christian area, see the church, see the liquor store. But yeah, sometimes personal considerations come in, right? That you're not breaking even. You purchased a mall, you're not breaking even. That's the biggest unit. Sometimes in life they can be a mix of considerations. They can be a mix of considerations. Sometimes it is haram for you to do what's more cautious. Let's say you are managing. You're a property manager for a third party. Can you there choose to do what's more cautious by your religious standards? Even if they're a Muslim, you have to act in accordance with the expressed best interest of the party that has entrusted you. So you're not allowed to be cautious, right? If you work as a taxi driver, right? For, let's say, an airport, one of these airport taxi services. You're not working independently, right? Can you choose to avoid taking certain types of customers? No, because you are harming your employer. Now, if it's your own, because there, your employment is a trust. You're working for someone else, and you have a limit of what your trust is. Okay, so this is where knowing the principles related to what is assistance in sin and what is not are very important. Because you can be cautious with your own choices, but you cannot be cautious when it comes to someone else's advantage. That you disadvantage them out of your own caution. Right? And this comes up a number of times in different countries where Muslim taxi drivers refuse to pick up customers from the airport because they're carrying alcohol from the duty-free shop. It'd be haram to refuse that because contractually you have to. And it's not prohibited in your religion because you're taking someone from point A to point B. What they have on them is not you're not responsible for that. It's a very interesting issue, the issue of assisting in sin, because there's so much fiqh related to it. Can someone work here in Canada as pizza delivery for pizza? What's the most common type of pizza that is sold? No prizes for guessing. Pepperoni pizza. Right? Pepperoni is haram, but can you work in delivering pizzas? What are you doing? You're taking a box from place A to place B. You're not responsible for that. Can you sell pepperoni pizza? That's a separate thing. No, you can't when you have choice. Right? That's a separate matter. Right? But the delivery, now if you have a choice, you try to choose something else. But we don't live in an ideal world. Right? Because you also have a responsibility for providing for family and paying your debts and expenses and many, many things. So that's where there's a balance of considerations. But even in the other last point to make, the last point to make is that sometimes when we get in a hard situation, there can be exceptions. Sometimes there are exceptions. Because that's a balance of the Sharia. I was asked, and I asked this question of some senior scholars, because there's a difference between a general ruling and a specific application. That, let's say, there's a difference between someone opening a pizza store and saying, well, I'm going to sell pepperoni pizzas that, like regular pepperoni from pork. You can't do that. But what if you took over? Let's say someone lost their father died, and the whole family's wealth is invested in a particular franchise, and they do not give you an exemption to sell non-pork pepperoni. What do? You have to just get rid of the store immediately? In those exceptional cases, those require specialists. Don't give yourself a fatwa. Either that no, I have to get rid of it, or no, I can keep it. Because those are sensitive cases. And those are sensitive cases, and they require caution. And sometimes our religion, the way of the Prophet ﷺ balances two amazing qualities: principle and pragmatism. Right? But not expedient pragmatism that leaves principle, but also not principle that is rigid and unconcerned about well-being. Right? There's a balance that the Sharia has come with. And those sensitive cases, they require, one should go to experts to deal with those kinds of cases. Because and many of these issues come up.